And now it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest today and a longtime friend of the Center for Continuing Education, the Reverend Dr. Alan Hilton. After attaining a Yale PhD in New Testament studies, Alan taught New Testament on the faculty of Yale Divinity School in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He then turned to church ministry, adding a decade of popular Bible teaching and preaching to lay people and pastors in churches across the country. From 2016 to the present, Dr. Hilton flies around the US to help people build community across lines of political, theological, and ethnic difference as the executive director of House United, a nonprofit organization, and the director of the Institute for Missional Studies at Covenant Presbyterian Church, USA, in Austin, Texas. His books include a scholarly treatment of Acts 4 called Illiterate Apostles, Uneducated Early Christians and the Literates Who Loved Them, and A House United, How the Church Can Save the World. Dr. Hilton lives in Austin with his beloved wife, Liz, and has two sons who are attending liberal arts colleges in Connecticut. Alan, welcome back for this important conversation.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm glad to see those of you who are on. It's great to see you, even though I can't really see you. I can see how many of you there are, and I can imagine you. So we're in this together for a bit today, and I don't know why. There's not really that much going on in the world. Let's see. Oh yeah, there's that election day coming, and I thought maybe the best way to begin today would be to tell a story that I think gathers hopes and fears in an election year and puts it right in the middle of our lives, because it's very possible in a fall like this, in a season like this, to begin becoming audience to what's going on and have ourselves rise and fall on the stock ticker of who's polling better, or how the race is going, or what the latest scandal is, and we can forget that the gist of this, the center of what we're going to be talking about today, is where it lands in our lives. Now, government has impact on our lives, obviously, but there's something beyond that. There are relationships, there are communities, there are family reunions and Thanksgiving dinners, and the kinds of places where we feel all too acutely the division of our nation. And so my story comes from a few years back. I'm an extrovert, right? And there's nothing I like better than sitting on an airplane or a train or a bus or wherever I am and asking 15 questions of the person next to me. I'm the guy you want to avoid on your next flight or ride. And yet I had been in Princeton doing a thing at Princeton Seminary a few years ago, and was just racked. I'd been doing an intensive with pastors from around the nation about this kind of thing that we're talking about red-blue difference and conflict. And I, who usually want to talk, just wanted to get on that Amtrak bound for Boston and another 3-day intensive and sit alone and soak my head. But the problem was, when I got to Trenton, the Amtrak station in Trenton, the train that I got on was full, almost all full. And so I walked through 4 cars before I found anything like an indicator that I might get a break from social interaction. And so I walked through 1, 2, 3, 4 cars. In the 5th car, there's a woman sitting with a book that's leaning toward the window, which to me is the international sign of I don't want to talk. So she's like this. She's kind of looking out the window and gazing at her book. And I see one seat next to her, and I hop into that seat and begin to pull out my book so that I can send the signal that I don't want to be talked to, when she turns to me and says, "Hi, what do you do for a living?" 2.5, 3 hours later, we finished an intense conversation, and it was a great one. If I hadn't had it, if I had found a seat alone, I wouldn't be able to tell you this story. She was from Blue Boston on her way home. But she didn't live in Blue Boston anymore. She lived in Baltimore. So she was coming home to visit family in the Boston area. But she and her husband were progressives, and they had made friends though in this Baltimore suburb with a red couple, a couple of conservatives who lived next to them, and they just loved these people. And for years they would go to dinner together and play tennis together and do a whole lot of things together, just hang out in front yards together. But then the 2016 election came, and then the 2020 election came, and they found themselves in the aftermath of the increased polarization, in the aftermath of the increased animosity and antipathy between the sides. They found themselves more and more estranged. It started with a coffee with her friend. The husband and wife on each side were good friends. She had coffee with her friend, and Donald Trump came up. And of course, that wouldn't be an easy topic for these two. And she found her friend distasteful, and her friend found her distasteful. And it happened like these things happen. The estrangement escalated when pretty soon they were cold shouldering one another, and wouldn't talk when they took their garbage out to the curb. This was the usual sort of mutual cancel in American culture. And on the train, as she told the story of losing this friend and how icy it was across the fence and in the front yards, she began to weep. And then she began to sob. And all of this because I told her what I do for a living. But after a time of her weeping, after a time of her having confided this, I said, there are some things you can do. And we had a talk, kind of like the presentations I give, some of what I'll say today, but we just talked. She talked about how she feels when she encounters this woman, and what she tries and how it doesn't work. And I gave her some thoughts about it. And we talked for 2.5 hours. We pulled into the Boston station, and I didn't know what was going to happen. But as we pulled in, she pulled out her phone and showed me that she had just texted her friend and said, "Shall we get lunch?" Friends, you and I live in a time when there are the reds and the blues, and tribalism has become a primary identifier of how Americans relate to one another. Political tribalism, what the One America movement and many others call toxic political polarization, the kind that hurts us. And so that relational aspect, as we wait to see who is going to be the next president, who is going to be the next elected official in our area, as we walk toward the voting booth, those relational problems, those distances and icy stares are where this hits home. So, what I hope to do today is address hopes and fears and move together to some secrets. Pardon me. We're doing some renovating. There's dust in our house. Move through to some secrets or some new ways forward in relationships, in media viewing, in the things that impact the way we look at one another. So, with that, I'm going to flash some slides, and we'll kind of walk our way through together. And there'll be 3 parts. We'll initially look kind of introductorily at what the current issue is, or what the current separation level is, and some aspects of that you and I are experiencing right now. Then we'll move to, how did we get to this? How did we become so estranged across red blue lines and other lines? In my introduction, Kelly mentioned that I work across racial lines, ethnic lines as well. So we'll ask, how did we get here? And then, where do we want to go? And then finally, how might we get there? How might we get to the new place, that imagined future that could be a shared future across the differences that we have? So, where are we? And what does it look like? How did we get there? How do we get home? And kind of where we want to go, and how do we get home? So with that, let me share share a slide and we'll get rolling. All right, there's my friend on the train after 2.5 hours. But this is what has taken full focus in American politics, obviously, but in American life. And you and I probably spend far too much time thinking about these two people. There is impact, as I said, of government, but there's also the prospect that we need not involve ourselves so much in the emotions that plague us when we think about the election. Um, here's where we are amidst this strain. Pew Research is a great place to go for polarization study. They do a lot of probing through survey how Americans feel about one another, what we think, and how we feel about right now the election. And the question is, who who always or often feels blank when thinking about the politics these days, and exhausted and angry win the day. We are all, or many of us, 2/3 or more of us, are pretty much worn out on politics, and not just worn out about it, but there's a seething little anger that sits beneath the surface because we don't like what's going on, even just in a big picture, much like kind of apart from who our candidate is or apart from what our political convictions are. We're tired of and a little angry at the dominance of government in our lives, or of politics in our lives. Sorry about that. That was wrong, not government, but politics. And I want to just begin by saying it doesn't need to be so. I'm facilitating a cohort of a handful of churches, 10 churches from around the nation, who are walking through on Zoom every Tuesday night, walking through the election season from September through the inauguration in January together. And it's not just any group, it's a group made up of Black and white and Pacific Islanders, made up of Latinx people, made up of red and blue and middle, made up of Missouri Synod Lutherans and United Church of Christ progressives, made up of a whole kind of what you would get for a focus group, except we're becoming church together. There's a Black church in the middle of Atlanta that is a leading church in that city, and there is a white suburban ELCA Lutheran church in Minneapolis, and then I mentioned the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. We all meet together, and it just happened the other night that the pastor or the mentor to this Samoan community in Utah, just outside Salt Lake City, shared with us on that Tuesday call that when I asked, how are your people doing in the election season? She said, the Samoan people I work with are hardly noticing it. See, these folks are first and second generation immigrants who came here for a reason. They came to make a better life for themselves. They came to set up a new house and a new living in a new place. And that's plenty to occupy their time. They don't see government as primary in the set of issues that they are daily dealing with. So they don't pay that much attention to the election, which may scandalize some of you or may surprise some of you. But it does illustrate that we don't all have to be enthralled by this election. I live in Austin, Texas. My wife is a graduate of the University of Texas and a proud alum. And so I have become a fan of the University of Texas football team. Steve Sarkisian is its coach, and he talks to his players about being a thermostat rather than a thermometer during this election season. In their lives and in all of the parts of their lives. So to be a setter of the temperature rather than a reflector of it, present rather than reactive. And I mentioned earlier how sometimes we can let our lives go up and down on a stock ticker like measure just because of whatever's happening in the news lately. I guarantee you that these Samoan Christians just outside Salt Lake City, Utah, are not sweating it as we are. Doesn't mean that the political decisions are not important. It means that they are not primarily concerned with it. So that's an option, is to pare back our attention and the way that we engage election. But we're not doing that very well. A Zogby poll in 21 asked Americans, do you imagine there will be a second civil war within the next 15 or 20 years? And more said yes than said no. This may come partly from our enthrallment and our over attention, but whatever is causing it, we don't just think we have the star-bellied Sneetches and others. We think that this may return us to the 1860s, that we may have a second civil war. And some say, some diplomats and political scientists and internationalists who have seen war in other countries, civil war in other countries, imagine that some of the first shots have been fired in some of the political violence that we've seen, that we've already entered in. In that context of an American division that is so vitriolic that we are thinking civil war might be imminent, Christians hear the voice of Jesus. We say a prayer in a lot of our congregations, Sunday to Sunday, that starts, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," and we call it the Lord's Prayer. But there's another Lord's Prayer, and it's in chapter 17 of the Gospel of John, and we don't say this one every Sunday, and that has cost us. Jesus prayed in his last day on earth before his crucifixion with his disciples in the upper room. Jesus prayed, "My prayer is not for my disciples alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, so that the world may know that you sent me and that you love them as you loved me." And I want to sit with this for a second. First off, if we're looking for the will of God about the way we relate to other people and the way Christians relate to one another, if we're looking for what God wants in this, a prayer of Jesus is probably a pretty good thing to track. And here, Jesus prays that the people who are following him, his disciples on the ground, who are about to scatter, by the way, and all of that is a part of the Holy Week story, but that Jesus's followers on the ground will be one, and not only they will be one, but the people who believe in Jesus through them will be one, and that's, of course, including us. Now, right now in the world globally, there are 45,000 Protestant Christian denominations. So one might ask, how are we doing with this? And the answer wouldn't be great, but closer to home, we are the people who kind of ramp up the culture wars. We are the people who had the Crusades and the Inquisitions. We are the people who don't have exactly the best history at this. But as people, you and I, here now on a Thursday noon in the United States of America in 2024, a month and a bit before the election, as people here, we can hear Jesus's voice come to us in our situation and challenge us to change the way we do one another, the way we respond to one another. And there's a second aspect to that. So if Jesus is praying that we all may be one, it's not simply so that you and I will get along, or that Christians will get along and be able to sing Kumbaya in a better way, or have robust fellowship together. I want you to notice what comes after the ellipsis on this passage. I pray this will happen, that they may be one, says Jesus, so that the world may know that you sent me and that you love them as you love me. Polls about what people think of Christianity or what people think of churches or Christians come up with words like judgmental and hypocritical and conflict-laden and a whole lot of other things that don't exactly tell the world who God is and that God loves them. Jesus says that if we become one, if we become answers to this prayer, we become a part of changing the way the world thinks about God. So there's not just an internal interest on the part of Christian groups. There's also this missional interest in leavening our world. And we'll get back to this, but those two incentives, that we have a more robust fellowship together and that we become a better testimony to God's grace in the world, aren't a bad incentivizer, right? And so as we move toward the shape of the problem and how we got here and all the things that we're coursing through, let's all keep Jesus's prayer in the back of our head. There are a lot of things that are mysterious about God. Here's one that's straight up on the bottom line. God wants us, Jesus prayed for us, to be unified and to come together as one. We'll get to a place where Paul also does that. But for now, let's just hold Jesus's prayer in kind of on the back of our brain as we go through. All right. We've looked at the antipathy and sort of the state of polarization. Other stats, by the way, over 50% of American parents would be very worried if their kid married somebody from the other political party. When we are asked to size up people on the other side of the board, or Pew Research did a thing in which they asked, how do you look at people on the other in the other party? And turns out 70% of us think that people on the other party are just a little more unintelligent than the normal person. And over 50% of us see the people on the other side and say, they're just a little more immoral than most people. So we've built this caricature of our opposites, and we ought to figure out why that is. So how did we get here? Here's MLK's analysis. This is from a speech he gave in Cornell College of Iowa in 1962. And you can see him there with the crowd. This is a year before the I Have a Dream speech. And he gives his analysis of the current problem in that time with racial violence, racial discord. He says, I am convinced that men, and I'm going to use his language, you can do your translation for gender. I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other. MLK's analysis of race in the early 60s was that social distance and even geographical distance was also producing the inability to communicate, the inability to engage, and therefore from fear comes hate. And so we can see that happening even as far back as 2016. A New Yorker article appeared in which the author said, we are really two nations now, left land and right land, and then went on to chronicle the norms of each of those groups or the beliefs of each of those groups. And so they may as well be living in separate territories because they aren't engaging one another. And that MLK would say is the root of the problem. Separation, distance, segregation from one another. Racially, it matters. Politically, it matters. And as we approach an election, we're watching that division widen. Toni Morrison is just a goddess in my view. She wrote Paradise, but she also wrote The Bluest Eyes. She wrote, many of you have read her books. I got to hear her years back at an American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature gathering in Philadelphia. She was the keynote. And when she walked into the room, folks, it was just this majestic presence. She had the authority that came with the wisdom of years and the wisdom of a literary mind that watches the world well. At the time, she was working on this book, Paradise. And Paradise is a fascinating, kind of ironically titled book. You should read it. It's one of her later novels. But as she was lecturing on it, she told us about the research that she had done to write this novel, just to seed her imagination and see the lay of the land. And she went and she researched all of the written and all of the oral tradition that she could find on the afterlife, on paradise, on heaven, all the epic treatments in the Greek works of Iliad and Odyssey, and the Latin works of the Virgil's Aeneid, and Dante's in the Middle Ages, Dante's Divine Comedy, and Milton, Paradise Lost. Then she also did oral tradition in Africa and Southeast Asia, and wherever she could find somebody talking about paradise, she took it in and registered it as a part of her research. And she said they're very different from one another. And of course, we're a bunch of AARSBL people who are taking our notes fastidiously, wearing our, not in style clothing, and leaning in because we're good students. And she said, but they have three things in common. She said, the three things that all of them share are community, eternity, and exclusion. You and me together, forever, without them. Isn't that fascinating? Even when we're all dressed up and ready to go to church and talk about paradise, there always has to be that third element. We have to be in and somebody else has to be out. And it turns out that evolutionary historians kind of agree with this. Jonathan Haidt is another good source. I mentioned Pew for research. Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of thinking about the divisions among us. His book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, is a very good. It's getting old now, but it's still current in its issues. But in it, he traces out and has talked to evolutionary psychologists and historians, and he traces out the history of humanity. And we realize that during hunter and gathering periods of kind of human history, you could be the strongest person in the whole region. And if you went it alone, if you tried to do your food gathering and your survival alone, you would lose to 12 weaker people because they have banded together and they defend one another. They defend their stored food. They have a division of labor, and there's no way that you can keep up with them. And so it became, we sorted as we survived in different stages of trying to survive as humans. As we survived, we found groupishness helped us. And the great advantage of it was it helped us survive. It helped us stay safe. It had its real advantages. Of course, groupishness has a disadvantage, which is that there is the in-group, but then there's also that whole world outside, the they. There's we and they, and we get pretty good at defining them. A study was done in Sheffield, England, University of Sheffield, and it's kind of a cool study. They were trying to find out if we're natively, if we're inherently, if we're instinctively racist. And so they put children, newborns, and then 3 months old, and then 9 months old babies in front of a screen. Now, we're told often to not have kids watching screen all the time, but this was a limited engagement. And they put them reclining in front of a screen, and they flashed 4 different facial types: Caucasian, African, Asian, and Arab, right? A facial type. And they flash it on the screen and leave it and watch how closely the infant or the young child engaged with a gaze. Did the gaze stay on the face, or when did it wander? And they found that, and then they put the image up for the same amount of time, each of the 4, and they found something interesting. As infants, as the newborns, these babies did not differentiate between the 4 faces. But by the time they were 3 months old, they were lingering significantly longer on the face that looked most like their caregiver's face. At 9 months, they had already embedded that memory and it had taken a place. The brain scientists could find the spot where this was being stored. It was being stored in long-term memory, and they were starting to lose any differentiation about the other three. So the other three had become vague for them, and their caregiver's facial type had become primary. Now, the answer to the question was, are we born racist? The infants didn't do that. But by the time they were 3 months old, they could differentiate who was safe from who wasn't certain, about whom they weren't certain. We very quickly have the equipment to identify in-group and out-group. And that pertains to all kinds of parts of human history. But it also is very applicable here because we tend to tribalize as a part of our equipment. It helped us to be groupish. But let me go back to the stat I gave you. In 1960, the same question about would you be worried if your son or daughter married somebody from across the line. This was 1960. Sputnik had just flown. Nixon and Kennedy were going at it in a presidential race. Donna Reed sweaters were all the rage. And 4% of American parents were worried that their kid might marry somebody from the other side of the aisle. So we've had this equipment a long time, but in 1960, it didn't manifest as a 50% or higher set of parents who were worried their kids were going to marry across the political aisle. So we have a tendency to tribalize. We have a tendency to find our echo chamber in our current situation. We have a tendency to find our news because it sounds like us. And we kind of want to differentiate from they. We have that tendency, but we've put it on steroids regarding politics in our time. And let's look at how that happened. In the 1990s, both MSNBC and Fox News arose in 1997. So that formerly there were three main, if you count PBS, four main sources of news that everybody watched. Now you could watch your own news. You could choose your news, and they became increasingly partisan, both Fox News and MSNBC. So people could tune into their worldview and have it reiterated over and over and over. Then in the 2000s came social media, and suddenly I could track people, and I could follow people, and I could be influenced by people who were in my tribe. And so social media came and amped that up. So the way we get our news, the way we get our information has changed during the very time when polarization numbers have skyrocketed. There's another factor. In 1994, the Gingrich Revolution was spawned. The election of 1994, the beginning of 1995, during Bill Clinton's first term in office, the House very famously or infamously turned red. The conservatives won the House, and Newt Gingrich, in a move that I might have made, and I'm not a guy who was ready to take over the House, or he said to his caucus, "Go and live in your district." And so you can raise money there. You can know your people there. You can not be seen as a Beltway person. You can not be seen as a Washington insider. You can be a person of the people. And as I say, that sounds reasonable. But the problem with it is that when they did that, these governing bodies, these legislators, went home, which was great, but they went away from each other. And so they'd be home on weekends instead of going to each other's kids' soccer games or going to the opera together or going to a movie together or just having dinner together. Suddenly left and right no longer engaged one another on this in social settings. The only place they would meet in Washington was on the battlefield in the debate. No longer was the other side personally engaged. The other side was simply a political opposite, a political opponent. That changed things in Washington by all kinds of people's analysis, that this was a turning point, this move to not being in Washington together socially. Then there was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the USSR and of worldwide communism as it had been. And suddenly the enemy, the evil empire for Americans had disappeared. So that while a sort of unity had built over the Cold War years among Americans through having a common enemy, suddenly that common enemy was gone, and sociologists looked, and there we were turning on each other. So there are historical contributors to why we are the way we are. There are also media contributors. There are changes in government political practice for the senators and members of the House in Washington. Those kinds of factors moved both among politicians and among everyday Americans, moved us slowly away from one another. The other factor that is not to be missed is identified in Ben Sasse. He was a conservative senator from Nebraska who wrote this book, Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. And in it, he gives what I think is the best analysis, at least the best one that I've seen, of the way that media and politicians have kind of found a mutuality in the fact that they gain more money in the case of media and donations in the case of politicians, and they gain more votes by moving to anger and moving to opposition. And so when Ben Sasse noticed that the combination of votes and money highly incentivize divisive behavior from our governing officials, and they are strongly drawn, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes very consciously, to the magnet of those two forces. And they want to stay in Washington, and they want to gain power, and they want to gain money. And media as well wants to get more clicks, and more clicks come when we're angry at each other, when we are scared. And so that becomes a factor. And I give you these factors not just to be sort of intellectual material. I give you these factors because they all have been factors in us as well. They've contributed to the way that we look at each other. And on this webinar, we're looking for ways out of this. We need to understand how we got into it a bit. But if we've understood how we got into it in some sort of, these is a combination of sociological, historical, and media forces, things that have moved us toward our current distrust of one another, our current suspicion of one another, our current inability to fathom one another across the political aisle and across other walls that divide us. Our next question is obvious. Where do we want to go? I work with a friend, David Anderson Hooker, who used to be in the Peace Institute, the Kroc Peace Institute in Notre Dame, but is a consultant and advisor in many different places. And one of the things that we do when we work together, we do work across racial lines, and we do work across lines of inclusion and exclusion. One of the things we do together is we see the tendency in American attempts to address bigotry or exclusion. We see the tendency to identify what we don't want to be. Becoming anti-racist has been a sort of mantra in certain corners of kind of American activism, becoming anti-racist, which is a great thing to become, except there's nothing to replace racism in that charge. So what do we want to be? David and I kind of very much work on what is the picture toward which we're moving. And so I want us to think together right here and now, what are we longing for? And so where do we want to go? And therefore, let's imagine a robust viewpoint diverse community? How do we actually maximize our differences rather than seeing them as threats? How do we see them as assets? And how would we get there becomes the question after that. So, first, for Christians who read Bible, this is just an amazing fact. Jesus, and these are pixelated, I'm sorry about it, but I thought I'd get funny looking pictures of Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot. Jesus had 12 spots in his team. He had 12 spots on his board, however you want to refer to the disciples. He, as a personnel director, he made an odd move. Because when he came down from the mountain in Luke chapter 6, having prayed all night, and announced who among the many who were following him, who would be a part of the 12, who would be closest to him and would be his main lieutenants and his main workers. He came down the hill with a list that included two people who were on opposite sides of the biggest, most controversial issue facing Jews in Palestine in the first century. The biggest issue was, how are we going to relate to the Roman Empire? How are we going to be relative to Rome's power over us? Now, they had been through they'd been through Babylonian captivity, before that Assyrian, after that Persian, after that Greek, after that Roman, and now that Roman domination was a part of their daily life. They could have to quarter people. They could have to carry gear. How are we going to relate to that empire that is now over us? And of course, a good lot of them said, we just need to keep making them as happy as they can be so they don't hurt us. And on the other side were people who said, we just need to overthrow this group. Finally, we need to have our own sovereignty, our own king. And in the midst of that vitriolic opposition on this issue, Jesus chose one guy from each side. Simon the Zealot was ready to overthrow Rome. Matthew the tax collector was raising revenue for Rome. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. It is a peculiar decision. But I want to kind of feature how Jesus might have thought about this and what the method to that madness might have been. Because when he got to the last week of his life in Jerusalem, Jesus was challenged by the local Jewish authorities. He was opposed by them and tested by them. And in Matthew 22, and by the way, also in the other Gospels also, Jesus runs into the question, okay, smart guy, should we pay taxes to the Roman Empire? And of course, this is going to be the dividing line between the two groups that Matthew and Simon represent, between the Rome apologists who say we just should be kind to them, we don't want to get hit in the head, and the revolutionaries who say we should throw them out. Jesus, when he gets the question, should we pay taxes to the Roman emperor, answers famously. He said, bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought him a coin, and he asked, whose image is this and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said to them, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And they were amazed at him. Jesus wriggled out of a devastatingly hard question that would have divided the popular opinion about him. And I think he crafted it when he was at campfire with these two from the two opposite sides. Consider having Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson on your team. That's how strange the decision was. But think Lincoln, team of rivals, famously brought people from different sides of the issues, brought people who were against his positions onto his cabinet because he thought this would be a good idea. This viewpoint diversity is actually going to help us run a country better. And in Jesus's case, it helped him answer the Pharisees and the authorities in Jerusalem better. I'm going to skip this because of time considerations. We may be able to get back to it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and Romans, by the way, Romans chapter 12, the Apostle Paul does something that is in some ways akin to Jesus's inclusion of two sides of the issue. He starts to spell out how spiritual gifts work. And he says there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it's the same God at work. He goes on to list those gifts, and he lists ones that matter for worship: speaking in tongues, prophecy, encouragement, teaching, right? But if we extend the list, and if you've ever preached or ever been preached to on this passage, we get people who are good at violining. We get people who are good at keeping accounting, keeping track of accounting. We get people who are good at a lot of things. One thing I have never heard is a preacher say, we want some people who are good at being conservative and who are good at being progressive. We want people from both sides, a la Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. We don't look at viewpoint opposition or viewpoint diversity as a gift, but Jesus seems to have. And Paul seems to have. He wanted that variety. He saw it as given by God. And so the question becomes, how can we imagine a world in which we actually think our differences are assets rather than threats? Turns out that the military world has found this. I do a lot of work in my professional life. I do a lot of work with military leaders because they have found a way to finish missions when they've got Black and white and Latinx and all kinds of ethnic difference. They've got red and blue and everything in between. They've got religious difference. They've got every kind of difference. But as Sebastian Junger chronicles in his book Tribe, which I highly recommend, on homecoming and belonging, these groups of very different people who somehow manage to work together become closer than family. So how do they do that? Well, they believe that the difference between the people becomes an asset in their ability to finish missions. Now, it presents difficulties, it presents conflicts, it presents tensions, but they figure it out because the mission is the thing. The activity that they're joining in trying to accomplish is the thing. And so if military gets it, interestingly, Larry Fitzgerald, who is a retired now Hall of Fame candidate as a receiver in the NFL, says sport gets it. It's his article for Sports Illustrated a few years ago was how sport can help America heal. And he looks in this article at how this team that draws from different races and geographies and political backgrounds and all kinds of differences manages to relax those tensions in the name of the greater good of being better at football together. Business also gets it. This is Scott Page, who wrote a book called The Difference. He's done extensive research on how the power of diversity creates better groups, firms, schools, and societies. He's done that research and found that you make better widgets if you have viewpoint diversity in the room. It causes tension. It's sometimes difficult to navigate, but you make more money because you make better widgets, and you market better because you know your people across all kinds of lines together. So in the military, in the athletic world, and in business, they get it. They get somehow that difference can be an asset, but we don't do so well with that in churches and in schools, it turns out, where ideas become primary and divide us and keep us loathing one another. So it's not only politics, churches and schools, which is kind of where you and I probably come from at some level, aren't doing so well at getting the epiphany that our differences help us. So how do we get there? The road home to one another. Right now, I'd like to pause before we go down this home stretch. I'd like to pause and collect questions. Kelly, can you give us the questions that have come in?
There aren't any questions currently
Okay.
in the chat. Let me check the Q&A here. So in the Q&A, I've got a couple of things. One, in the Constitution, the president can hold meetings more often than once a year to discuss unifying the government. Um, let's see. He has the power to convene full dialogue and to ask Congress to meet and to discuss these issues. What's your opinion about whether or not the president, whoever that may be, should be doing that?
Oh, it's a good question, and I'm for it. They are they're disinclined mostly, although occasionally in recent history, presidents have done a little work to try bipartisan things. They generally have taken the lead of the polarized ground that we're on and not done that. I would love to see more meetings with left and right in the move in any room, and in a president's room. That's marvelous. I'm a West Wing fan, and the television program, The West Wing, not the physical place. And in it, there's a line where the fictional president, Jed Bartlett, uh, commands his chief of staff to hire a very staunch conservative. Now, Bartlett is a Democrat and a moderate progressive, um, and he wants a Republican, a conservative, outspoken on his staff. And the chief of staff pushes back, and it turns out the president says, "I want smart people who disagree with me in the room." That was Lincoln's approach, and I think it helps govern. Uh, Otherwise, you're governing to half the people. So yes, I would love to see a change in the habits of Washington on that. Kelly, it looks like we're getting a few more questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I know you're not a historian in this particular area, Alan, but wasn't there a political polarization after the Civil War, and how did we move through that as a nation?
Yeah, so I'll spend just a short time because Kelly's right about my expertise on this. Um, we were nearly as polarized and in the time leading up to the Civil War as we are now. We've we've outdone the pre-Civil War period, according to sociologists and historians. But we're pretty close to where they were, and of course, war broke out. In the aftermath, it's not like they all suddenly enjoyed one another. There were still deep rifts, and some bit was done to help that. Some of Lincoln's speeches made it a point to uh, to not take a highly superior point of view into his speeches, where Union is superior and Confederacy is evil and stupid, right? Which, by the way, remember I quoted those stats earlier. We tend to think that if somebody disagrees with us, it must be because they're either evil or stupid. Those stats that I gave you, um, Lincoln tried to preempt that assumption. There were um, there were a lot of other measures taken, but there were still deep rift, and we still see the historic impact of the North-South division in the way politics go in the United States today. Um, but I won't go further than that because
Yeah.
yes, there continued to be division, and it continues to pervade now along some of the same lines.
So one of our attendees has commented that the stats from the Pew surveys are very powerful. Do you have any tricks or suggestions about how to best use these to hold up the mirror lovingly for folks in their own
Yeah,
congregation?
yeah. So what I tend to do, and some of this will come up, I appreciate the question. Some of this will come up as I go forward. Um, because when we get to how we get home, which is the next bit, I'll try to uh, layer the answer to your question in there because it kind of is in the mix. So if you don't mind, questioner, I'll hold, and if I haven't gotten back to it by the end, let's revisit. Okay?
Okay, you want to take one more now?
Yeah, one more would be great.
Okay. I see fundraising for a Democratic candidate based on fear, which this person finds very annoying. They're very saddened that this is happening. It seems that the we versus they is very ingrained in this election. Can you voice a way that this could happen in a better way? Instead of going
Yeah.
to fear, how could they approach this in a better way?
Yeah, so sociologists tell us that that groups unite around one of two things. Groups unite sometimes around a common enemy. We talked about the Cold War. And other times, the other alternative is to unite around a common cause. And the latter has been elusive to us because I mentioned earlier the New Yorker article 8 years ago that had left land and right land. And there are a lot of people who are despairing that we are unable to, that it will be impossible to even picture together a future that we all would like. But it's my conviction that if we listen to one another, we can find enough common ground to say, we don't all agree on what the future should look like. That's clear. And we're actually going to be helped by those differences. But it's when we go to the extremes of saying, if that candidate wins, the whole democracy is going to explode. Or if moving the other way, if that candidate wins, the whole democracy is going to explode. Because I'm hearing it from both sides. From one side, it's the structure of democracy is going to be taken down by a dictatorial way of governing if Donald Trump wins. On the other side, I hear socialism and ultimately communism will usurp the American way if Kamala Harris wins. So people are tossing around the fears you're talking about. I think The Way Home has some picture of a shared future and how we might have enough overlap in our stories to figure that out. And I'll just give you a quick kind of data from my experience. I do courageous conversations around the nation. You'll hear about them in a little bit. And I have people talk about immigration and healthcare and climate change and all the things that are the most hot button issues that you don't want to talk about at Thanksgiving dinner, right? I put it in the middle of the room and teach people how to engage one another about it. And what's striking to me, and I'll give an example. What's striking to me is I did a guns conversation, faith and firearms, in a church in Atlanta, just outside Atlanta, Sandy Springs, Georgia, and they came into the room on this issue of guns. They came in the room very suspicious of one another. They kind of knew each other's politics, and they were just holding kind of, their backs were up, they were tense. And within 10 minutes, they had realized, you know what? We all want the same thing. We want safety. We just think differently about how it comes, right? So we keep arguing about the politics, but if we can just know these are the ways that we want to be together. We want to be safe. We want to be in communities that are not broken in half. We want to be, if we can outline those, and that's sort of the road to that is kind of what's next, then we can look at a narrative that has room for everybody, a future, a way of being nation and neighborhood that has room to absorb even the differences that are significant. So that's my short go at it, and I think we're gonna kind of get to some of the means to that in just a second. So I appreciate your questions, and I hope to leave a little time for more questions when we get to about 15 after the hour, and then we'll kind of close it up. All right. So let's go back and roll forward with the question: how do we get there? And as Kelly said in her introduction, I've been doing this 8 years, and before that, the first courageous conversation I led was 2012. So it's been 12 years since then. It was on the marriage amendment in Minnesota, and 450 people came, right? Our church filled with people who were talking about the amendment, and we had them talk to one another. And that was kind of the birth of my ministry going in that direction. I've been doing this for all those years, pardon me, and I've gained some wisdom of experience, and here's what I have found. One is that listening is a primary handicap for us because we aren't very good at it. We tend to quickly dismiss people on the basis of their first 10 words and roll our eyes or begin to craft our opposition. And so Otto Scharmer is a leadership guru in MIT. They have a program called Theory U, in which he who has worked with the great leaders, corporate world, great leaders, nonprofit world, great leaders, educational world, around the world. And he has kind of condensed what he sees in them because he sees them as the best listeners in the world. And he sees that as a primary reason why they're succeeding as leaders. And here's what he's seen. He's seen that most of us, human community, listen above this dotted line, this first dotted line, in what he calls listening one. We download, we listen with habits of judgment in which we're either confirming our old opinions or we're getting ready to shoot down the other person's opinion. In other words, you've had this happen. You listen for if there's agreement, and if there's agreement, your whole self starts to feel good. It's been found that people who sit and listen to news, they can be alone in their house. They can be as lonely as all get out. They're alone in their house, and their kind of news commentary comes on. And brain scientists say that what happens in their brain is a cousin to what happens when good friendship is being celebrated. So we get a lot of juice from this agrees with me. And we get a lot of vitriol from this disagrees with me. And a lot of us live there because we like that juice, and we actually nurse along the savory animosity that somebody's opposition gives us. But Charmer says the great leaders of the world do the three things below that line. Listening 2, 3, and 4 are factual listening, which is listening with an open mind, and empathic listening with an open heart, and generative listening with an open will. And I'm going to go through each of those now kind of quickly because I think this is a ball game issue. Getting better at listening. And it seemed, in a season of political activism, in a season when I'm getting 15 emails a day and texts a day from people who are raising funds for a candidate, and when you're probably getting the same, it may seem a little bit innocuous to get better at listening. But hear me out. No pun intended. Jonathan Sachs, as a precursor to good listening, identified a main problem among us, which is that humility is the orphaned virtue of our age. Look around you in American culture, look around you and find how self-righteous, how sure of our opinions we are. And humility seems to go wanting. And Jonathan Sachs, the superhero rabbi from London of blessed memory now, identified that for us and said, we could do better. Humility would actually help us do community better. And he worked a lot in multicultural communities. He worked a lot in interfaith discussions. He was at the borderlines and sort of charged the people with whom he worked with cultivating a humility. And when I go from place to place, one of the things I do is in the benediction after I preach in churches around the nation, I challenge them for 2 weeks, once a day, to look in the mirror and say, I could be wrong. It's a simple exercise, but it reminds us of something that our culture is not reminding us of, which is that certainty about our position, it kind of hurts the ball club, because it can't be that everything that I believe is certainly right. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have convictions. It means we maybe should hold them with a little humility. And I could be wrong ends up a decent mantra, not to make us less confident when we talk to people, but to make us more humble when we talk to people. And the Charmer example is Charles Darwin, who carried around a notebook inside his jacket. And if he heard somebody come up to him and say, I loved your Origin of Species, I just think it's brilliant, he wouldn't take his notebook out. He'd say, thank you. But if he had somebody come up and say, I completely disagree with your third chapter, I think you're way off base, he would take out the notebook because it didn't do him any good to hear an amen. He wanted disconfirming evidence. He wanted to learn new facts that would help him shape his theories better. So he became an example for Charmer of listening for new facts, listening for things that might even disconfirm our current convictions so that we can get them more right. That's not what we're socialized to in American culture. And Charmer says it's one of the characteristics of good leaders that he deals with day in and day out. Here's one that blew me away. We were doing that faith in firearms conversation at a different church a few months later, and one of the participants sent me this. On the issue of guns, this is guns per person versus gun homicide rate from 1993 to 2013. As guns per person, gun ownership went up, the number of gun homicides per 100,000 people went down. That just blew me away. That was a new fact that I had never known. And it went into this sort of Darwinian place where I had operated with assumptions that weren't statistically accurate. And it made for a better conversation. And somebody else produced a fact that sort of not challenged this fact, but challenged this point of view that had generated this fact. And we started dealing in actual facts. This first level of listening looks for those. The second level of listening is listening with an open heart, and this is empathy. Empathy happens to be under attack in our time. There are a lot of people who think that, for instance, the husband of a conservative senator who is outlandish, who gets sick, the senator's husband gets sick, deserves none of my pity or empathy because they deserve their sickness. This is happening a lot. People are saying empathy is a problem because some people don't deserve our compassion. Now, I don't know any place in the life or teaching of Jesus where we could justify that kind of position. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, all those kinds of things just come in behind that kind of claim and say, nope. Empathy is a big part. The decline in empathy is a big part of why we can be so blatantly angry at one another and hold such ruthless views of one another. I was doing a courageous conversation in Scottsdale at a Pinnacle Presbyterian Church in Scottsdale, and we had 120 people in the room talking about climate change. And it got kind of vehement. People think I want them to be nice in these conversations. I actually want them to do conflict and get better at doing conflict. And in this one, they did conflict. In fact, they got red in the face and started to kind of get personal in their criticism of one another. So I stopped them and said, why don't you wait 90 seconds? Just everybody go quiet for 90 seconds and imagine somebody from the other side of the argument than yourself, right? Just imagine somebody's life. And so we did 90 seconds, and 90 seconds is a long time in a quiet room with 120 people. But they did it. And during, I saw a woman I knew in the back row begin to weep and then begin to sob. And I was curious. Everybody had done their work, but she was outwardly impacted and moved. So I knew her well enough to say, I don't want to put you on the spot, Elizabeth, but would you be willing to share what went on in you? And she said, I am a climate activist, climate change activist. I am an environmentalist. I want the second and third and fourth generation to enjoy a planet that is ready for them. But as I was sitting there, I imagined the West Virginia farmer who doesn't have the luxury of thinking out 2 or 3 or 4 generations. He's barely putting food on his table, and I represent him losing his job. And Alan, it didn't make me change my conviction. I still think we ought to get on board with treating our planet better. But it did make me change my perception of people who disagree on this with me. I used to think they're just stupid. But there are some people whose livelihood depends on, and she went on, you see how she listened to somebody who wasn't even in the room with an open heart. That's empathy. And it's putting yourself in another's shoes. And here's Kate Galing. I won't tell the whole story. She found, as a high school debater, the #1 ranked debater in the nation as a high school student. I got to kind of interview her once, and she said, I knew I would be, the competition of debate would be great. And I knew the research of debate would be great for me. What I didn't know was that it was going to make me a better person. She said, having to understand the case against which I was arguing from the point of view of the people arguing it, so that I could argue against it, I had to fully embrace what they were saying in order to get better at refuting it or at arguing against it. And it made me better at listening to people. Empathy. We'll get back to the life swappers. There's a technique here that I'm going to lay out for you. And it's just a way of listening to one another deeply that allows us to introduce one another in the first person. The people in the room were in Fargo, North Dakota. And there had been you see black and brown people next to white people. There had been a refugee population brought into Fargo. And the white farmers and oil people who had been working in North Dakota for long, sometimes 4 or 5 generation farms, and the mostly African and some Arab and Asian refugees were coming in, and there was a real social problem. There started to be more crime between them. There started to be legislation proposed that would end any kind of refugee resettlement in the area. And so a group called Narrative 4 came in and had them together for 2 days. And they listened for 2 hours, 3 hours to one another's story. And they couldn't ask a leading question. All they could do is ask, what was your life like? And the people told their whole biography. And then after one person had listened for 3 hours, they shifted to after lunch, and the other person listened for 3 hours. So you've got a Ghanaian refugee talking with a 4-generation Minnesota farm or North Dakota farmer. And after those hours of listening, the next day they sat next to each other and introduced one another in the first person. So you've got the farmer on the right telling the story of the Ghanaian who had built a business in Ghana, and then the political situation uprooted them, and they landed, and he had started a tech business in Fargo, and it was succeeding. And this guy who's telling the story, this tough North Dakota farmer, just started to weep because he had never considered the life of the people he was proposing legislation about. He wept and he said, "This guy is the American dream. This guy is what we want to have happen." They were on opposite sides. And then the Ghanaian told the story of the North Dakota farmer. We've been in this place farming for 4 generations, and everything changes, and we don't know how to adapt it. They knew each other after that time, and they became friends actually, and started to do things together socially. That's empathy. That's an open heart to one another. And it's a practice that I recommend. I'm going to have to skip a couple. Listen from the future is what I try to help people do in these courageous conversations. And by listen from the future, this is the one where Otto Scharmer says we have an open will, or as Christian or religious people, we might say an open spirit. This is an openness to whatever God will do through this conversation. We're going to hope that something bigger than is happening before we came together can happen because we're together. I'm going to listen expectantly for what our future might look like because of what we're talking about now. And so it's kind of a harder one to describe, but it's my favorite of the levels of listening, because it gets beyond I can understand you to we can collaborate. We can build something better together because we have different opinions. So I'm going to listen closely to you because you may be bringing the voice of God into my life. You may be pointing out, or we might, through this combination, be living into a better new thing that God is building. What you see pictured here happened in Wellesley, Massachusetts. The town council had been, or the board of select people had been gnawing on the question of Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day. And we had this courageous conversation, and 120 people gathered in a room too tiny for 120 people. It's this chapel in the church at Wellesley Village Church. And they did it because the town council threw up their hands, and they were just about coming to fisticuffs in their meetings. They couldn't come to an agreement on whether they should have Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day or both, and tempers ran high. So they gave up and said, "Town, why don't you talk about it and get back to us?" So the pastor that I'd worked with before and done several conversations with this church with called and said, Alan, why don't you come in and lead a courageous conversation among us on this issue? So we did. We said Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, or both or neither. And they talked for an hour and a half, and they talked well because they had practiced. And when they were finished, they you can see some people, everybody seems to be leaning in. It's because they listened closely to one another over the course of the time. And when we finished, I prayed to close, and it turns out there were people from the town council in the back row, and they ran to the pastor and said, you guys need to have more of these because we don't know how to do them. The Christians had figured out, the church had figured out how to listen well and talk well to one another. And the town council and the whole town said, we need this. Can you do more of them? Remember when Jesus prayed, I pray that not only my disciples, but also the ones who believe in them through my word will be one, so that the world may know that you sent me and that you love them even as you love me. I guarantee you those town council members went away with a different view of religion than they came with. I said, these people have a clue. They actually seem to love one another, and we want help. So we've come kind of full circle. And courageous conversations are a way to do this, a way to practice. I won't tell the whole story, but I went to college as a 138-pound weakling and went away being able to lift people pretty easily in my arms because I lifted weights. And I'll go straight to this. This is that group in Wellesley who were looking for answers about Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day, and they were at odds with one another, and a courageous conversation helped them, right? That changed the way that they looked at one another because they suddenly thought, we can talk to one another if we get some help. All right. Let's go to questions, Kelly, that are, I made it at 17 after the hour. We're 2 minutes beyond where I hoped, but let's go to questions that have developed since then.
Sure. Well, I'm going to start with a question that I have for you.
Okay, great.
So, and this is kind of coming off of the Wesley example that you just gave us. I'm going to use a term I've heard you use before. So for most of us, our churches, our congregations aren't all red or all blue. They're mostly purple, right?
Yep.
But often do not have these types of conversations, either in order to keep the peace, avoid conflict, not be uncomfortable, that type of thing. So how important is it that congregations engage in these conversations, and how important is it that they are modeling this for the wider community?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Q. What I find is that churches that maintain unity by hiding their differences are not highly trusting communities because they're showing each other their best side, their Sunday best, but they aren't seeing one another. They aren't sharing with one another the things that they might have difference about. And so their unity is tenuous and fragile. If something hit the fan, they would have no way of dealing with it. The robust kind of community that I pictured in the slide that introduced this section, the robust kind of community is one that knows the differences and loves each other, not just in spite of the differences, but partly because of the differences. My wife Liz and I are different than one another, very different than one another. And I am so glad that she is fiscally conservative with our household, because I am fiscally venturesome. And if we made decisions on the basis of my opinion on things all the time, we would definitely be in the poorhouse. I like that she pulls me back, and she kind of likes that I pull her out. And we say often we have friendships and relationships in which we say it's a really good thing that we're different from one another. If churches can say with 1 Corinthians 12, with Jesus's choice of Matthew and Simon the Zealot, churches can say, let's take this baby out for a spin. They will find not only that they get better at loving one another, because this classic sort of relationship is just your romantic relationship or any friendship is great until you see the first thing you don't like about the other person, and then you get to actually ask, do I want to keep going here? Agape is unconditioned love, and that's the Greek word that captures Jesus's command that we love one another, John 13, that we love our neighbor as ourselves, Matthew 6, that we love our enemies, Matthew 6. Um, in order to really become God's people, Jesus followers, we need to put the challenges of community in front of us and actually deal with how we disagree. And I guarantee you, I see it in churches where I'm working around the nation. It matters for becoming a fully trusting community. We say, if I can love you in spite of the spinach in your teeth politically, the thing I disagree with, my love has become stronger. And same with yours. So, Kelly, your question's good. I find that when conflict is brought to the surface and we actually exchange on it, we realize, wait a second, nobody died. No fatalities. We had a crazy conversation. Nobody died. In fact, I kind of liked it. Usually the crazy conversations are more highly attended the second time I come than the first time, because people realize, A, we want to be able to do this, and B, it actually is engaging. So long way of answering, but I find these make for more robust community, this celebrating the red blue rather than trying to hide it under the rug.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
We've got a question here that I'm gonna try to interpret a little bit because it's a little cryptic, but a person could have empathy and understanding, but perhaps cannot compromise on an issue of injustice. And
Yep.
our questioner is just wondering if the Bible addresses this in any way.
Well, I'll take you to an example of that addresses it, and then I'll go to scripture. So I'm going to share my screen again. Let's see. Let's go back to this guy. There he is. This is Dylan Marone, and he is an internet content producer, a digital content producer. And he gave a TED talk called "Empathy is Not Endorsement," and this is exactly where the questioner is, I think. If I connect with someone, if I express my affection for or unconditioned love for someone, if I say I'm going to pray for someone who has a ghastly conviction in my view, am I compromising my own conviction? And what he says, he does internet content, and he has people, because in the gender issue in bathrooms in North Carolina that happened a few years ago, when gender bathrooms and who could use them blew up for the first time in the American kind of larger discussion. He went and found trans people and interviewed them in bathrooms. And it was a video that and that's the kind of out there stuff he did. So politically provocative stuff, in his case, from the left. But what the difference between him and other provocateurs is that he would get the comments, which were vicious. People would come on and threaten his life. People would come on and say horrible things about him. And he was a digitally agile guy, so he would find their IP address, and then he would trace out and find, if he could, their phone number, and often he could. And so he would call these people who had said horrible things about him, who had threatened his life, and say, "Hi, I'm Dylan Marone, and you seem not to like me too much. I'd love to talk about it." You're probably laughing. I'm still kind of giggling at it, and I heard about this for the first time years ago. But he said some of them hang up immediately. Others of them would stay on and say, "I didn't know there was a person behind this. I didn't really think about it. I just did." And he became friends with some of those people. Often they would say, "I'm sorry I hurt you." And so here was a case where he says, I was empathizing with these people. I was trying to understand why they would be so angry as to send me a death threat or something that was mean. And they responded not by taking my point of view, but we had a chance to be in relationship. We had a chance to cross the line of difference between us, not changing our views, but changing the way we dealt with one another. And I think one of the things, and I'll come back off the screen. I recommend that it's as I say, Dylan Marone is out there, but I recommend that TED Talk. It's an excellent and inspiring attempt to do some of this cross difference work personally, not to persuade people of his point of view, but personally to connect with people and break down some stereotypes. In the Bible, Jesus didn't agree with the Samaritan view of God. He didn't agree with it. But he told a story about a good Samaritan, and he sat with a Samaritan woman at the well, and people criticized him for hanging with Samaritans. He wasn't saying, I've become Samaritan. He was saying, I've become empathic with Samaritans. I have come to know that they are people who are they're people for whom God created. And later in Paul's letters, he would say they're people for whom Christ died. So the connectedness to somebody you disagree with is not endorsement and doesn't need to require a change of view on either part. The conviction remains, and we need to stay with our conviction. Sometimes when people talk about purple church, they think what I mean is everybody needs to meet in the middle and think the same thing. That's not at all it. I think we lose when we do that. But we do need to understand why each other thinks the way we do and understand that we can coexist and find ways to maximize. So I think biblically, Jesus does it by bringing the Samaritans in and other ways that just blow people's minds about who he hangs with, right? You hang with sinners and tax collectors, you hang with Samaritans, all of these things. Well, that wasn't, I'm suddenly agreeing with them. It was, I am seeing them as people God made. Same with Paul in his letters. These are people for whom Christ died.